Late November 1944. Fog lies thick over the fields east of Jülich in Germany, and a gunner presses his eye to a periscope scarred with frost. Somewhere out there, a shape too heavy for any ordinary tank grinds forward through the mist. 68 tons of German steel that no American gun has ever managed to stop head-on. This gunner already knows what that machine can do. He has watched an older tank destroyer, armed with a gun barely strong enough to matter at this range, trade fire with something far weaker than what is coming now, and lose. His own weapon is different. A 90mm gun, built originally to shoot down bombers 6 miles overhead, now bolted into a turret his own crew has trusted for barely 2 months. The tank rolling toward them does not know this gun exists. Neither, in truth, does most of the German army. In the next few minutes, one shot, placed just right, on ground the enemy cannot escape, will decide whether Battery C, 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, becomes the first American crew in this sector to put Germany's heaviest tank in the ground with a single well-aimed round, or one more name added to a list of tank destroyers that tried and did not come home. Make yourself comfortable with your favorite drink. Then check the time and tell us exactly what your clock says right now. We'd love to know what time people around the world are joining us. In September of 1942, on the Eastern Front near Leningrad, a new German tank went into action for the first time. It weighed nearly 57 tons, carried armor up to 4 inches thick, and mounted an 88mm gun capable of killing almost anything on the battlefield before that target could ever close the range enough to fire back with any hope of success. The Germans called it the Tiger. Word of what it could do spread through every army fighting against Germany long before most Allied soldiers ever saw one with their own eyes. And when the first Tigers appeared in Tunisia that winter, the shock was not a rumor anymore. American tank crews watched 75mm shells bounce off its front plate at ranges where their own vehicles had already been killed twice over. The tank destroyer battalions rushed forward to answer that threat. First the lightly armored M10 Wolverine, and later the fast M18 Hellcat, brought real speed and a workable gun to the desert, and later to Italy. But by the autumn of 1942, it was already clear on paper, in cold arithmetic nobody wanted to say out loud, that the standard 3-inch gun on the M10 could only be trusted to punch through the frontal armor of Germany's heaviest tanks at range measured in a few hundred yards, not the 1,000 or more a crew needed simply to survive the exchange. The Army needed a bigger gun and a better armored vehicle to answer the Tiger and whatever came after it. That need would not be filled for 2 more years, and the men who would eventually carry that answer into battle had, in fact, already begun training for a different vehicle entirely, months before anyone in the United States Army had ever heard the word Tiger. On December the 15th, 1941, 8 days after Pearl Harbor, the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion was activated at Fort Benning, Georgia. The men who filled its ranks over the following months came from across the country, farm boys from the Midwest, factory hands from the industrial Northeast, a scattering of college students who had enlisted rather than waited for a draft board letter, thrown together under officers who were, in more than a few cases, learning the new tank destroyer doctrine from the same training manuals as the privates standing in formation in front of them. The doctrine itself was young and still being argued over inside the Army's own planning offices, built on the idea that tanks existed to break through enemy lines, and tank destroyers existed to hunt down whatever armor the enemy sent in response. Fast, lightly built vehicles meant to ambush from a hidden position, fire, and displace before the enemy could ever bring his own gun to bear. On the parade ground at Fort Benning, drilling with the M10 Wolverine month after month through 1942 and into 1943, it was an idea that made a certain kind of sense. Nobody in that battalion yet knew how badly the real battlefield would complicate it. Training at Fort Benning stretched on through 1942 and into 1943, month after month of the same drills repeated until they became reflex, loading crews timed with stopwatches until they could load, aim, and fire in a rhythm none of them thought about anymore, driving instructors barking corrections at men learning to feel the balance of a 30-ton hull through the seat of their pants alone. It was tedious work, most of it. The kind of training that never once let a man forget how far he still was from anything resembling a real battlefield. And more than one letter home from those months complained less about the danger nobody had yet faced than about the plain boredom of a Georgia summer spent waiting for orders that seemed, for a very long time, never to come. The 702nd sailed for England early in 1944, arriving on February the 25th, and spent the following months in final training on the English coast, waterproofing vehicles, drilling waterborne landings, and listening to briefings that grew steadily more specific, without ever naming a date or a beach. Officers who had spent 2 years teaching tank destroyer doctrine out of a manual now found themselves teaching it within sight of the channel itself, aware that whatever came next would test every assumption in that manual against an enemy who had already been fighting this exact kind of war for 5 years. That date arrived on June the 6th. The battalion itself did not land in the first waves, following instead 5 days behind the initial assault, its M10s grinding up out of the surf onto Omaha Beach on June the 11th, into a landing zone already scarred by a week of fighting, wrecked landing craft still burning in the shallows, engineers working to clear obstacles the tide kept uncovering, the whole beach smelling of salt water, diesel exhaust, and something underneath both that no man in that battalion needed explained to him. Combat came quickly after that. The battalion entered operations at Livry, France on July the 2nd, attached in support of the 2nd Armored Division, as that division pushed south into the tangled hedgerow country the men had started calling bocage within days of learning the French word for it. Nothing in training at Fort Benning had prepared these crews for what bocage fighting actually meant. Each field in that part of Normandy sat boxed in by earthen banks, topped with hedges grown thick and tangled over centuries, banks that stopped a Sherman's main gun from depressing far enough to fire through a gap, and stopped an M10's tracks from climbing over without exposing its thin belly armor to whatever waited in the next field. Visibility rarely extended beyond 100 yards in any direction. German infantry, dug into the base of these hedgerows with Panzerfausts and machine guns, could let an American column pass within arm's reach, and then open fire from 3 sides at once. It was, by every account left behind by the men who fought through it, some of the ugliest close-range combat of the entire war in the West. The air in that country carried its own particular weight that summer, the sweet rot of cattle killed by shell fire lying bloated in the fields for days before anyone had time to bury them, crushed apples fermenting in orchards no one would harvest that year, wood smoke drifting from farmhouses burned the night before, all of it trapped low between the hedgerow banks with almost no wind to carry it away. Men who had trained for open tank country in Georgia found themselves instead fighting a war measured in single fields, one hedgerow captured and held while the next one, invisible until a man was almost standing in it, hid whatever waited on the other side. It was in this kind of country, on the 3rd week of July, that the gunners of the 702nd first understood in the most direct terms possible just how badly outgunned their own vehicles were. A patrol from Battery C, moving to support infantry probing toward a crossroads the maps called nothing more than a number, spotted a German Panther dug in behind a hedge line at just under 600 yards. The gunner, a young man not yet 20, who had fired this same gun 100 times against range targets back in Georgia, laid his sight carefully on the Panther's front plate and fired. The round struck almost dead center and did not go through. It shattered instead in a spray of orange sparks that told the crew everything they needed to know in less time than it took to reload. The Panther's own gun answered within seconds, and the M10, its open top offering no protection at all against a shell fired nearly level with the ground, took the hit through the hull. 3 men climbed out. 2 did not. It was not the first such loss the battalion had suffered since Omaha, and it would not be the last, but word of it moved through the battery that same evening the way bad news always did among men who understood plainly what had happened and why. 3 inches of gun against a sloped front plate their own shells simply could not defeat, at a range close enough that the German crew never had to work very hard to win the exchange. Men who had shared a tent with the 2 who did not climb out found themselves that night doing the same private arithmetic every crew in the battalion had already started doing without ever quite saying it aloud, counting the seconds it took to reload against the seconds it took a Panther gunner to correct his aim, and coming up short every time. Nobody wrote that arithmetic down in any official report. It rode with every crew anyway, into every field that came after. Late in July, the 702nd found itself caught up in something larger than any single hedgerow fight, Operation Cobra. The breakout offensive meant finally to tear open the German line west of St. Lo and let American armor loose into open country beyond the Bocage. Combat Command B of the 2nd Armored Division, under Brigadier General Isaac White, spearheaded much of that advance, and the 702nd moved with it, providing anti-tank support as White's tanks and infantry pushed through a German defense already reeling under the heaviest tactical bombing the Western Front had yet seen. For 4 days at the end of July, Company B of the battalion fought hard enough in support of that advance to later earn a Distinguished Unit Citation, engaging German armor and infantry in a running fight across ground that changed hands more than once before the line finally broke for good. It was by any honest measure a victory, part of a breakout that would in a matter of weeks carry American armor from the hedgerows of Normandy across most of northern France. It did not feel, to the men actually inside the M10s doing the fighting, like a clean or a cheap one. Bombers of the 8th Air Force had opened the offensive with a raid heavier than anything the Western Front had yet seen, wave after wave crossing overhead until the ground itself seemed to shudder, and in the chaos that followed some of those bombs fell short of their German targets and struck American units waiting to advance, a mistake that cost lives among the very men the raid was meant to clear a path for. The crews of the 702nd, dug in behind the line waiting for the order to move, felt that same ground shake under them and understood, before any officer explained it, that even a plan built on overwhelming force could still go wrong in ways no amount of training prepared a man to expect. Cobra succeeded because American numbers, American artillery, and American air power ground the German defense down past the point where any single tank duel mattered very much to the outcome. It did not change the plain fact that when a 702nd gun crew met a Panther or a Tiger front to front at anything past a few hundred yards, the smart money and the honest odds still favored the German gun. By the middle of August, the breakout had become a rout, German forces streaming east out of the collapsing Falaise pocket under a punishment from the air that few of the men on the ground below could fully appreciate at the time, and the 702nd moved with the rest of 2nd Armored Division in the long, fast pursuit across France that followed, through towns whose names most of the crews forgot within days and would spend the rest of their lives trying to remember correctly. Northern France fell behind them through the last weeks of August and into September, the pursuit finally slowing as fuel supply lines, stretched now farther from the beaches than anyone had planned for, could no longer keep pace with the armor racing ahead of them. Somewhere in those weeks of hard, fast movement, word began to circulate through the tank destroyer battalions of the theater, in the particular half-rumor, half-official memorandum way that news of new equipment always seemed to travel among men far from any factory floor, that a new vehicle was coming, built on the same hull most of them already knew, but carrying a gun nearly 3 times the size of anything they had fired at a German tank so far. No one in Battery C had seen one yet. Most of the men who had did not entirely believe the numbers they had been told, and more than one veteran gunner said openly that he would believe a bigger gun could save his life only after he had watched it happen with his own eyes, not before. What they did know, by September of 1944, standing now at the edge of German territory itself, with the Rhineland campaign about to open in front of them, was written plainly enough in their own after-action reports, and in the silent arithmetic every crew carried in the back of their mind before every engagement. Their 3-inch gun could kill a panther, if the range was short enough, if the shot was placed just right, if luck ran their way instead of the other crews. Against a tiger, the odds grew worse still. They had spent 3 months now learning, the hardest way there is to learn anything, precisely what that gun could and could not do. What none of them yet knew, in those first days of September, standing at last on ground that belonged to Germany itself rather than to the friendly, ruined countryside of France, was how soon they would find out whether the new gun everyone kept talking about could finally close that gap, or whether it was one more promise that would arrive, like so many others had, a little too late for the men who needed it most. The Rhineland campaign opened officially on September the 15th, 1944, and somewhere in the weeks around that date, the rumor finally became real. Ordnance trucks rolled into the 702nd's rear area, carrying a vehicle most of the crews had only heard described second-hand, built on the same hull and the same running gear as the M10 they already knew by feel, but wearing a new turret entirely, taller, more angular. A long 90mm gun projecting from its face and a distinctive cast bustle bulging out the back to counterbalance the weight of that gun and its far larger breech. The designation stenciled on new equipment manifests read simply, 90mm gun motor carriage, M36. The men who gathered around the first examples delivered to Battery C walked its length the way a man might walk around a horse he was about to bet money on, running a hand along the new gun's barrel, testing the weight of a shell nearly a foot longer than the one they had been loading for 3 months, asking questions the young ordnance lieutenant sent to brief them could only partly answer. Some of the questions were practical, about maintenance schedules and ammunition stowage, and how the heavier turret would handle on the same soft, muddy ground that had already worn out more than one set of tracks on the older M10. Others were quieter, more personal, the kind of question a veteran gunner asked without really expecting a clear answer, whether this new gun would actually change anything that mattered, or whether it was simply a heavier version of the same promise that had already let them down more than once since Normandy. Training on the new gun in the field was, by necessity, brief. There was no time to send crews back to a proper gunnery range for weeks of instruction, the way training at Fort Benning had once allowed. Instead, a battery might get a single afternoon firing a handful of practice rounds at a wrecked German Hulk, dragged out to the edge of a field, a short course on the new ammunition, and then orders to move back into the line within days. Loaders who had spent months developing a rhythm with the old 3-inch shell now had to relearn that rhythm entirely, bracing themselves hard against the turret wall before every shot after the first few rounds sent more than one man stumbling backward, caught off guard by a recoil violently out of proportion to anything the smaller gun had ever produced. The new gun's muzzle blast threw up such a cloud of dust and disturbed air that gunners frequently lost sight of their own target in the instant after firing, a problem serious enough that more than one crew learned to count silently to 3 after the shot, before trying to spot the fall of their round, rather than straining uselessly against a cloud of their own making. It was not, in those first weeks, a weapon anyone in Battery C fully trusted yet. It was simply the weapon they now had, and the war in front of them did not wait for that trust to develop on its own schedule. The turret itself brought its own quiet dread, along with its new gun. Like the M10 before it, the M36 had been built with an open top, a deliberate engineering choice made 2 years earlier to save weight the vehicle's suspension could not otherwise carry, and every crew that climbed into it understood within their first week in combat precisely what that choice cost them. A shell that would have burst harmlessly against a closed steel roof instead rained fragments directly down into the fighting compartment. A sniper working from the upper floor of a shattered farmhouse could put a round into a man standing exposed from the waist up without ever needing to score a hit on the vehicle itself. In the second week of November, During a sharp exchange of artillery fire outside one of the small farming villages east of the American line, a burst of German shrapnel caught a loader in Battery C across the shoulder and arm as he stood in the open hatch passing ammunition up from the bustle rack, wounds serious enough to send him back through the aid station and out of the war for good, though not serious enough to kill him. He was fortunate, and every man in his crew understood just how narrow that fortune had been. A few inches lower and the same fragment would have opened his throat instead of his shoulder. The commander who wrote up the incident that evening kept his report short and factual, a habit most officers in the battalion had learned by then, since there was rarely anything useful to add to the bare facts of who had been hit, how badly, and where the crew stood afterward. Word of it moved through the battery the way word of every such wound did, quietly, without much discussion. Each man left to draw his own private conclusions about how much protection an open roof actually offered against the particular kind of war they were now fighting. Block by German block, farmhouse by German farmhouse. The first real test came within days, in a series of small engagements along the western approaches to the Roer River that never earned a name in any history book, exchanges of fire between American and German armor that lasted minutes rather than hours, and were reported afterward, if they were reported at all, in a single clipped line of a battalion log. What those first engagements taught Battery C was not the clean, decisive lesson the ordnance briefings had promised. Against a Panther's sloped front plate, even the new 90mm gun sometimes failed to penetrate cleanly, the standard armor-piercing round shattering against German steel, hardened in a way American engineers back home had not fully anticipated when they built their own test plates. A gunner who had waited months for a weapon finally capable of killing a Panther head-on found, in his first real chance to do just that, a round that struck true and still did not finish the job. It was a bitter thing to learn, made worse by how closely it echoed everything these same crews had already learned the hard way with the old 3-inch gun, and worse still for arriving after weeks of faint hope that this one piece of new equipment might finally be the exception to a pattern the battalion had grown far too used to. The bigger gun had not, on its own, erased 3 months of hard experience telling every man in that turret to trust range and angle and patience over raw faith in a number stenciled on a shell casing. What did change things, gradually and unevenly through October, was a newer round entering battery ammunition stocks in slowly growing numbers, a tungsten cord shell designated T-30E6, built to fly faster and hit harder than the standard round, capable of punching through the frontal upper plate of a Panther, where the ordinary round so often failed. The trouble was scarcity. This new ammunition arrived in trickles, a handful of rounds per battery on a good week, rationed out by battery commanders who understood how much difference a single round of it could make and how few of them they actually had to work with. Battery commanders kept careful count of how many rounds of the new ammunition sat in each vehicle's rack before every engagement, and more than one gun crew went into a fight knowing they had only 2 or 3 rounds of the good ammunition to work with, rounds that had to be saved deliberately for the one shot that would actually matter, rather than fired early out of simple frustration with a target that would not die. Crews adapted the only way soldiers ever adapt to a shortage that will not be solved by wishing, by changing where and how they chose to fight, rather than what they fought with. Instead of standing and trading shots front to front with a Panther or a Tiger, gun crews learned to work the flanks wherever the ground allowed it, maneuvering for a shot at a turret side or a hull side where armor ran thinner and where even the ordinary round, saved now for precisely this kind of shot, stood a real chance of finishing the job the frontal engagement so often could not. It was slower work, more patient, more dependent on ground and timing, and a battery commander willing to spend an extra 20 minutes maneuvering rather than simply opening fire from the first position that offered a shot. It asked more of every man in the crew, too, of a driver who had to read the ground well enough to find a covered approach to a flank shot without exposing the vehicle's own thin side armor in the process, of a commander who had to judge, often with only seconds to decide, whether the extra minute needed to reach a better angle was worth the risk of losing the shot altogether if the German tank moved first. It was also, through the last weeks of October, beginning to work. Around this same time, command of the 2nd Armored Division passed to Major General Ernest Harmon, a hard-driving cavalryman already known through the theater for a temper that ran short with excuses and long with results, returning to a division he had commanded once before and pushing it now, through the muddy, exhausted ground east of Aachen, toward the Roer River and the German heartland beyond it. Harmon had a reputation, earned in North Africa and in Sicily, before he ever set foot in this part of Europe, for visiting the front himself, rather than trusting a map spread out on a headquarters table miles behind the line, and men in the tank destroyer battalions attached to his division learned quickly that a general who asked pointed, specific questions about a battery's ammunition supply was not a man who accepted a vague answer twice. Under Harmon, the division's attached tank destroyer battalions found themselves worked hard and worked constantly, part of the wider 9th Army offensive driving to close on the Roer from the west, through a landscape of small German farming towns whose names, Setterich, Pufendorf, Immendorf, Frealdenhoven, meant nothing to the men fighting through them, beyond the next objective on a map and the next few hundred yards of open, exposed farmland that had to be crossed under fire to reach it. Each of those villages followed a pattern that grew grimly familiar to the crews of the 702nd as November wore on. Artillery would open first, American guns working over a village suspected of holding a German garrison for 20 minutes or more, before infantry moved forward across open beet fields, with tank destroyers following close behind to answer any armor the barrage had not already accounted for. German defenders dug in among stone farmhouses whose walls could stop a rifle round without much trouble, held on stubbornly in most of these villages, sometimes for the better part of a full day, before withdrawing east under cover of darkness to the next village and the next defensive line, only to make the Americans fight the same grinding fight over again a few miles farther on. It was not the kind of warfare any newsreel back home was likely to make dramatic. It was slow, costly, exhausting work, measured in a single farmhouse or a single crossroads at a time. And it wore down men and machines alike in ways that did not always show up clearly in a battalion's casualty figures. The ground itself worked against the Americans as much as any German gun did. This stretch of the Rhineland in November offered almost none of the cover the hedgerows of Normandy had provided. Open beet fields and sugar beet stubble stretching flat for hundreds of yards between one small village and the next, crossed by drainage ditches deep enough to break a track and by roads turned to axle-deep mud under weeks of autumn rain. A tank destroyer caught moving across that open ground in daylight had almost nowhere to hide, and German gunners dug in around the edge of a village, patient and well-concealed, could pick their moment and their target with a clear field of fire measured in over 1,000 yards in some directions. More than one crew in Battery C learned to dread open ground in that country more than they had ever dreaded a hedgerow they could not see past, trading one kind of danger for another that felt, in its own way, just as unforgiving. Not every engagement that autumn ended in the kind of grim uncertainty that had defined so much of the fighting since Normandy. In the 3rd week of November, a section of Battery C caught a pair of German Panzer IVs crossing open ground near one of the smaller villages east of Pufendorf, older, lighter tanks that carried nowhere near the armor of a Panther or a Tiger, and that the battery's gunners, by this point in the campaign, had learned to treat as a far more manageable problem. Both were destroyed within minutes, at a range where the 90mm gun's power was never seriously in question, the rounds punching cleanly through side armor that would have shrugged off nothing heavier than a rifle bullet, and the section withdrew afterward, without a scratch on any of its own vehicles. It was a small action, unremarkable enough that it barely rated a line in the battalion log, but it mattered to the men who fought it in a way that a bigger, more dramatic engagement might not have. It was proof, however modest, that the new gun worked just as promised against the great majority of what the German army actually still had left to throw at them, and that the deep, private fear built up over 3 months of fighting panthers and tigers, did not have to color every single encounter with German armor from here to the end of the war. In the middle of the month, German command threw a counterattack into this same stretch of front, built around elements of the 9th Panzer Division, reinforced by King Tigers, drawn from a heavy tank battalion held in reserve for a moment like this one, an attempt to blunt the American advance before it could reach the river and buy time for defenses still being dug along the Roer's eastern bank. The counterattack did not spend itself in a single afternoon. It ground on in fits and starts through the days that followed, flaring up along different stretches of the same front as German commanders looked for any weak point in the American line, and it was still pressing, nearly 2 weeks later, when it finally reached the fields outside Freialdenhoven. For the crews of Battery C, word of King Tigers moving into their sector arrived the way such word always did, among tank destroyer crews that autumn, second-hand, half-confirmed, passed along a chain of radio traffic and shouted warnings from infantry who had already seen the shape of one moving through the fog at first light. No one in that battery needed the warning explained twice, or spelled out in any greater detail than the word tiger itself already carried on its own. Every man in that battery already carried, from Normandy onward, a working knowledge of what a King Tiger's armor could shrug off, and how little margin for error a crew had once one of those tanks found their range first. The night before, in the battery's forward position, few men slept more than an hour or two at a stretch. The temperature had dropped hard after sunset, cold enough that condensation froze along the inside of every periscope and had to be scraped away by hand before dawn, cold enough that crews took turns running engines for a few minutes at a time through the night just to keep enough warmth in the hull to function. Somewhere out in the dark, engine noise carried faintly across the flat ground from the direction the Germans were expected to come, the low, grinding rumble that every man in that battery had learned by now to associate with tracked vehicles moving in low gear, though nobody could yet say for certain how many, or how heavy. A young lieutenant making his rounds along the position that night found most of the crews awake, despite orders to rest in shifts, sitting in small groups near their vehicles rather than inside them, talking in low voices about nothing in particular, the kind of quiet, aimless conversation men fall into less because they have anything to say and more because silence, on a night like that one, leaves too much room for a man's own thoughts. On the morning of November the 28th, near the village of Freialdenhoven, that knowledge stopped being an abstract fear and became the exact shape of the day's fighting. A King Tiger from the German heavy battalion supporting the 9th Panzer counterattack pushed forward through drifting ground fog toward American positions dug in along the village's western edge, its long 88mm gun traversing slowly as it searched for a target worth the shot. American tank destroyers positioned along a low rise south of the village held their fire, waiting, the particular kind of waiting that asks a crew to sit still and do nothing while a machine capable of killing them in a single round comes steadily closer, because a shot fired too early from too great a range does nothing but reveal a position that patience might otherwise have kept hidden. Inside each vehicle, the waiting had its own physical shape. A gunner kept his eye pressed to the sight until the rubber cup left a ring on his skin, adjusting range estimates by fractions of a degree as the shape in the fog grew larger and more distinct. A loader stood with a round already cradled and ready, not daring to shift his grip for fear the small sound of metal against metal might carry farther than it should in the heavy, damp air. A commander watched through his own periscope and said almost nothing, aware that the wrong word spoken too soon could cost the whole crew the one advantage patience was buying them, the advantage of being seen last. Somewhere in that waiting, a decision was made, and one of the destroyers along the rise opened fire, not at the Tiger's front, where 3 months of hard experience had already taught every gunner in that battery the odds ran badly against them, but at an angle chosen carefully enough to catch the tank's track and running gear as it crossed the American front at a shallow diagonal. The round struck true. The King Tiger lurched, one track torn loose from its drive sprocket, and came to a stop, still facing largely forward, its crew now working frantically to bring the huge turret around toward the muzzle flash that had just crippled them, a machine still armed and still dangerous but no longer able to run. What happened in the next several minutes has survived mostly in the flat, clipped language of after-action reports rather than in any memoir written years later by the men who lived through it, but the shape of it is clear enough from those same reports. With the Tiger immobilized and its turret still traversing, a second tank destroyer, an M36 from Battery C, maneuvered for the shot every crew in that battery had spent the autumn learning to wait for, a clean angle on the tank's turret side rather than its front. At a range of almost exactly 1,000 yards, holding his breath without quite noticing he had done it, the gunner fired. The 90mm round struck the Tiger's turret side and this time did not shatter or skip away into the mud behind it. It went through. Smoke began rising from the hull within seconds, thick and black against the pale morning fog, and the tank that had spent 3 months existing in every crew's mind as something close to unkillable sat burning on the open, frozen ground west of Frialdenhoven, while what remained of its crew scrambled clear into the ditches on either side of the road. There was no cheering recorded in any surviving account of that morning, no dramatic scene of men climbing out of their own vehicle to celebrate. Crews who had just watched a machine they had feared for 3 straight months burn out in front of them mostly did what tired soldiers in the middle of an active battlefield actually do after a kill. They checked their own ammunition racks, scanned the tree lines for whatever might be coming next behind the wreck, and waited for orders rather than allowing themselves the luxury of a moment they knew from hard experience the war would not grant them for long. What the after-action reports do note, in language as plain and unadorned as any bureaucratic record ever manages, is a simple fact that meant more to the men of Battery C than any citation could have. A King Tiger, the single most feared tank fielded by any army in the European theater, had been engaged, immobilized, and destroyed by an American tank destroyer crew using exactly the tactics they had spent 2 hard months in the Rhineland teaching themselves through trial and costly error, a track shot to stop it, followed by a turret shot to finish it. Patience and angle substituting for the raw frontal power the gun alone still could not always provide. Word of the engagement moved through the battalion in the following days, the way word of a real victory always did among men who had spent 3 months absorbing nothing but bad news about German armor, quietly at first, then with a kind of cautious pride that men who had learned not to trust good news too quickly allowed themselves only once the smoke had genuinely cleared and the wreck had been confirmed sitting exactly where the report said it would be. For the gunner who had fired that final shot, and for the loader and driver who had shared the turret and the hull with him through the whole tense morning, the moment carried a weight that no citation could fully capture either, a private, almost disbelieving relief that the machine so many other crews had died trying to fight had, this one time, ended up burning instead of them. It did not erase the 2 men lost to a Panther's gun back in July, or the loader carried off on a stretcher earlier that same month with shrapnel in his shoulder. It did not make the next village any less dangerous to cross, or the next morning's fog any less likely to hide another Tiger somewhere in it. And every man in that crew understood, even in the hushed minutes right after the kill, that the war in front of them was nowhere close to finished, and that their own luck, however well earned that morning, was not a thing any soldier could count on holding indefinitely. What it did, for a battery that had spent 3 straight months absorbing hard lessons about exactly how outmatched their equipment could feel, was prove something none of the ordnance briefings back in September had ever quite managed to prove on their own, that the gun now riding in their own turret, handled with patience and the right angle, really could kill the machine that had haunted every one of them since Tunisia and Normandy alike. It did not mean the danger was over, and no one in that battery mistook one destroyed Tiger for proof that the balance of the war had shifted for good. German intelligence through the autumn of 1944 had consistently underestimated the American 90mm gun, in most cases still logging the M36 in their own reports as nothing more than an older M10 carrying the same 3-inch weapon American crews had fought with since Normandy, a mistaken assumption built on distant reconnaissance photographs that could not resolve the difference between one gun barrel and another from 6,000 feet up through drifting winter cloud. That mistake would cost German crews dearly in the weeks ahead, but it had not yet been corrected, and it meant every fresh Panther or Tiger crew moving into this sector still believed, with the same misplaced confidence that had cost the crew at Freyaldenhoven their tank, that American tank destroyers could not reach them at the ranges these new guns now actually commanded. It was a strange kind of advantage to hold, one that depended entirely on the enemy continuing not to notice something sitting in plain sight, and every officer in Battery C who understood how the advantage worked also understood how easily and how suddenly it could disappear the moment a single accurate intelligence report finally made its way up the German chain of command. By the first week of December, the fighting along the Roer had settled into a hard, grinding stalemate. American forces held short of a full river crossing by flooding the Germans themselves had engineered upstream, releasing water from dams the Allies could not yet capture or destroy, turning the Roer into a barrier no armor could cross regardless of how many Panthers or Tigers waited on the far side to contest it. Engineers studying the dams from the air had warned for weeks that the Germans held exactly this option in reserve, and when the water finally came, it came slowly and deliberately, rather than in a single dramatic flood, the river rising day by day until fields that had been merely muddy were now standing under a foot or more of cold, slow-moving water, drowning the vehicle routes American planners had spent weeks mapping out for the crossing they could no longer attempt. For the exhausted crews of the 702nd, dug in now along a front that had stopped moving forward for the first time in months, it felt almost like a pause, a chance to service worn engines, replace tracks ground thin by weeks of hard driving through mud, and write letters home that could not begin to explain what the last 2 months had actually been like. Maintenance crews worked long hours in the cold rebuilding engines that had been run nearly around the clock since Normandy, and for a few days at the start of December there was even hot food served from a real field kitchen rather than heated over a can in the back of a turret, small comforts that men who had spent 2 months eating cold rations in a beet field noticed and appreciated far more than anyone back home would ever have guessed. Some crews used the lull to write long letters they had been putting off for weeks, careful, censored letters that could say almost nothing true about where they were or what they had seen, and that said everything that actually mattered anyway, in the simple fact that they had been written at all. None of them yet knew that this pause was about to end in the worst possible way, not with orders to resume the advance toward the Rhine, but with word, arriving in the pre-dawn hours of December the 16th, that the German army had launched an offensive nobody in the Ardennes sector to the south had seen coming, and that the 2nd Armored Division, Battery C among its attached units, was about to be pulled out of the line it had spent 2 brutal months fighting to reach, and sent racing south into weather and danger none of them could yet fully picture. Orders came down not as a gradual build-up, but as a sudden, urgent scramble, refuel, rearm, and move within hours. The kind of order that told every experienced man in that battery, long before any officer explained the reason for it, that something had gone badly wrong somewhere else on the front. Badly enough that a division which had just spent 2 months fighting its way to the Roer was being pulled back out of that fight entirely and sent, in the dead of a European winter, toward a battle none of them had asked for and none of them yet understood. The march south took 2 days and 2 nights of almost continuous movement, columns of tanks and tank destroyers crawling along icy roads never designed to carry this much armor at once, headlights blacked out to slits, drivers navigating more by the dim shape of the vehicle ahead than by anything they could actually see of the road itself. Snow fell for much of the journey, thick enough at times to reduce visibility to a few dozen yards, and more than one vehicle in the column slid off the frozen roadbed into a ditch, requiring precious minutes the whole column could not really spare to winch it back onto solid ground. The men of Battery C, still carrying the quiet confidence of Frialdenhoven with them, found that confidence tempered fast by simple exhaustion, by cold that crept into a turret no closed hatch could fully keep out, by the growing understanding, passed back along the column in fragments of rumor, and the occasional terse briefing from an officer who did not know very much more than his own men did, that something had gone badly wrong far to the south, and that whatever they were about to meet there was larger and more dangerous than anything they had yet faced in the Rhineland. Men slept in short, broken stretches whenever the column halted, wedged into whatever corner of the turret or the hull offered a few inches of space, waking each time to the same numb cold and the same low rumble of engines idling ahead and behind them in the dark. Rumor filled the gaps that official briefings left open, and rumor that week was rarely reassuring. Talk of American units overrun in their first hours of fighting, of paratroopers dropped behind German lines in disguised uniforms, of a whole American regiment surrendering en masse somewhere in the hills the column had not yet reached. Most of it would later prove exaggerated or simply false, the ordinary distortion that spreads through any army moving fast toward a fight it does not yet understand. But none of the men riding south that week had any way of knowing that at the time, and the uncertainty itself wore on crews already stretched thin by 2 straight months of hard fighting in the Rhineland. What had gone wrong they would learn only gradually over the following days was the opening of the largest German offensive in the West since 1943, field armies driving through the thinly held Ardennes front in a desperate attempt to reach the Meuse River, cross it, and push on toward the port of Antwerp before Allied strength in the West could recover from the shock. Among the German spearheads driving hardest and fastest toward that river was the 2nd Panzer Division, commanded by Colonel Meinrad von Lauchert, a unit that by December the 23rd had achieved the single deepest penetration of any German formation in the entire offensive, its lead elements reaching a point barely 9 kilometers from the Meuse itself before the advance finally ran out of the one resource no amount of skill or aggression could substitute for: fuel. Strung out and increasingly isolated near the small Belgian villages of Cels and Foy Notre Dame, with American forces closing in from both the north and the south, and with the fuel tanks of Lauchert's own tanks running close to empty, the division's exposed spearhead dug in and waited, uncertain whether resupply would reach them before the Americans did. Major General Ernest Harmon, commanding the 2nd Armored Division now arriving in the sector after its own hard march south, studied the reports of Lauchert's exposed and immobilized spearhead with the same blunt, results-driven instinct that had defined his command since North Africa, and requested permission from his corps commander, Major General Joseph Collins, to strike immediately rather than wait for a more cautious, methodical build-up. Collins granted it. What followed, through the day after Christmas and building toward it, was not a single dramatic charge but a careful, 2-pronged movement. Combat Command B pushing to squeeze the German position at Foy Notre Dame and Cels between 2 American task forces closing from different directions at once, cutting off any avenue of retreat before the trap closed fully shut. For Battery C, the days leading into that attack meant long hours of movement through bitter cold, positioning and repositioning along roads turned to solid ice by a cold snap that had finally, after weeks of fog and low cloud, brought clear skies back to the Ardennes. That clearing weather mattered more than most infantrymen on the ground fully appreciated in the moment. For the better part of a week, cloud cover thick enough to ground nearly every Allied aircraft in the theater had denied American forces the air power that had done so much to blunt earlier German offensives, and its sudden return on December the 23rd meant fighter bombers could finally work the roads and columns the German spearhead depended on for whatever fuel and ammunition still might reach it. Crews on the ground could hear the change in the sky before most of them fully understood what it meant. Engine noise overhead that had been almost entirely absent for a week, suddenly filling the cold morning air again, followed at intervals by the distant crump of bombs and rockets finding targets along roads the Germans no longer had any real way to defend from the air. On the morning of December the 25th, Combat Command B moved against the German positions dug in around Celles. For a battery that had spent the autumn learning patience against dug-in, well-concealed armor, the fighting that followed offered a strange kind of advantage that Frealdenhoven never had. German tanks that could not simply withdraw or maneuver freely once their fuel ran low enough, forced instead to stand and fight from fixed positions that American gunners, working now with real experience against exactly this kind of target, could study and approach with far more confidence than 3 months earlier. A Panther dug into a hedge line near Celles, its crew fighting with the particular desperation of men who understood their own fuel gauge, left them no realistic option to retreat, still represented a genuine threat at close range, capable of destroying an M36 in a single well-placed shot, exactly as it always had. But a Panther that could not reposition once its position was known, that could not fall back to fight another day the way German armor so often had through the autumn, was a Panther that patient, coordinated American fire, artillery, air support, and tank destroyers working together, rather than each service fighting its own separate battle, could eventually locate, isolate, and destroy. There was a particular strangeness to fighting a battle on Christmas Day that more than one man in Battery C remarked on afterward, snow lying thick and unbroken over the fields around Celles in a way that might, in any other year, have looked almost peaceful from a distance, broken now by the black smoke of burning vehicles and the flat crack of tank guns, instead of by church bells or the quiet of a holiday morning. Crews who had grown up in homes where Christmas meant something specific and warm found themselves instead loading shells into a cold breech with fingers gone stiff inside frozen gloves, and if any man allowed himself a private thought about where he would rather have been that morning, he kept it to himself and went on doing his job, because the war in front of him did not pause to observe the date any more than it had paused for any other day since Normandy. The fighting on Christmas Day and through the day that followed was not a clean or a bloodless affair for the men of Battery C or for any of the American units converging on the trapped German spearhead. Vehicles were lost on both sides. In short, violent exchanges of fire across snow-covered fields and narrow village streets where the range between American and German armor sometimes closed to a few hundred yards or less before either side even had a clear shot. But by the time the fighting around Celles and Foy Notre Dame had run its course, the results, tallied afterward by staff officers working from unit reports across the whole engagement, were stark enough to matter well beyond this single stretch of Belgian countryside. Roughly 10,000 American troops had taken part in the action, and in exchange for their own losses had destroyed some 405 German vehicles, including 88 tanks and assault guns, inflicted approximately 2,500 German casualties, and taken 1,200 prisoners. The 2nd Panzer Division, one of the most capable formations in the entire German army, and the unit that had driven deeper into Allied territory than any other in the whole offensive, had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force at the exact point where it had come closest to achieving the breakthrough the entire German plan depended on. Colonel von Lockhart survived the encirclement and would go on to command other units before the war's end, but the division he had led to within 9 kilometers of the Meuse did not survive Celles in any form that mattered to the wider battle. For the crews of Battery C, the fighting brought neither the muted, private satisfaction of Frealdenhoven nor any dramatic sense of a war being won in a single afternoon. It brought instead the particular, exhausted relief of men who had spent 9 straight days moving, fighting, and freezing without more than a few hours of real sleep at any single stretch, checking their own vehicle and their own crew for damage once the shooting finally slowed, and finding, this time, that both had survived largely intact. The 2nd Armored Division continued fighting through the remaining weeks of the Bulge, as the German offensive collapsed under the weight of exhausted fuel reserves, clear skies, and American reinforcement pouring into the sector from every direction, and the 702nd moved with it into the new year, back east eventually toward the Rhine, and in the final weeks of the war that spring, into the Central Europe campaign that carried American armor deep into what remained of Germany itself, before the surrender in May finally ended the fighting the battalion had been part of since a beach in Normandy the previous June. By then, the 90mm gun that Battery C had once regarded with open skepticism had become, without much ceremony or announcement, simply the gun they trusted most, and the open-topped turret they had once dreaded on cold mornings in the Rhineland had carried them through Frealdenhoven and Celles and every smaller fight in between, all the way to the end of the war in one piece. Not every man who had climbed into that turret back in September survived to see that final surrender, and the battery's own roster by May of 1945 carried names that had not been on it a year earlier, replacements who had joined somewhere along the long road from the Ruhr to the heart of Germany, and who had never fired the old 3-inch gun at all. Who knew the 90mm as simply the weapon they had always had, rather than as the hard-won answer to 2 years of frustration that the veterans among them understood it to be? The wider tank destroyer doctrine that had shaped the 702nd's entire existence did not survive the war nearly as well as the men who had fought under it. Within months of Germany's surrender, the Army quietly abandoned the concept that had governed the battalion since its activation at Fort Benning, folding independent tank destroyer battalions out of the post-war force structure entirely, and adopting instead the simpler, harder-learned lesson of the European campaign, that tanks needed to be built and armed well enough from the start to fight other tanks directly, rather than relying on a separate specialized branch to do that fighting for them. The M36's own open-top design, so costly in wounded men across a dozen different battlefields, hastened the arrival of its own eventual successor, the M26 Pershing, a fully armored tank carrying a comparable 90mm gun inside a closed, protected turret that finally gave American crews the firepower they had needed, since Normandy, without asking them to fight, exposed to the sky above every battlefield they crossed. None of that came as any particular surprise or disappointment to the men who had actually crewed the M36 through the autumn and winter of 1944. They had climbed into an open turret because it was the vehicle the Army had been able to build fast enough to matter, and they had used it to kill a machine that had haunted every one of them since the deserts of Tunisia. A King Tiger burning in a beet field outside Frealdenhoven, and a Panzer division broken in the snow outside Celles, standing as the clearest possible answer to a question that had followed the tank destroyer force since 1942, whether America could actually build a weapon capable of meeting Germany's heaviest armor on something close to even terms. By the final weeks of the war in Europe, the men of Battery C already knew the answer, not from any ordnance report or any general citation, but from the plain, hard-earned memory of 2 mornings, 4 weeks apart, when a gun nobody had fully trusted did exactly what it had been built to do. They did not think of themselves, in the years that followed, as men who had fought some especially remarkable campaign. Most went home in the second half of 1945 to jobs and families and a country eager to move past the war rather than dwell on it, carrying their own memories of Frealdenhoven and Celles quietly, the way so many men of that generation carried everything, without much need to explain it to anyone who had not been there. What they had actually done, in a beet field outside a German village nobody back home had ever heard of, and in the snow around a Belgian crossroads most of them never learned to pronounce correctly, was answer, in the plainest terms a battlefield ever offers, a question that had followed American armor since the first Tiger appeared in the deserts of Tunisia 2 years earlier. The gun had finally caught up with the threat, and the men who carried it into those 2 winter mornings had proven, at a cost only they ever fully understood, that it was enough.